Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. My name is Sergio Gonzalez. I'm the author of Mexicans in Wisconsin. It's an honor to be with you here tonight. I just drove in from Madison, and I'm dealing with a cold right now, so I'm going to do my best to stay upright for the next hour and a half. If I fall, just push me back up, and we'll move through this together. I'm really excited to be doing this talk with you today. This book came out in October of last year. And since it came out, I've had the opportunity to speak with communities across southeast Wisconsin. I'm heading up to Green Bay next month to kind of expand the scope a little bit. And it's just been wonderful to share some of the stories of this book. Before I get started, has anybody actually read the book yet? Oh, fantastic. Me neither. That's good. All right. So, I'm just kidding. I got a lot of jokes for you. So.
I have it. I just haven't read it.
That's all right. Here's my promotion. I'll be selling books after the end of the talk today, if you're interested. So here's what I want to do today. I want to tell a little bit about why I decided to write this book. And then in the short time that we have here together, I'd like to go over very briefly a very long history. There's no way that in the time we have together today, we could do all of the history of Mexicans in Wisconsin, but hopefully it can instigate some larger conversation. And then at the end, after I've given my kind of prepared remarks here, I'm interested to have a conversation with everyone here in the audience. So there are two main reasons why I decided to write this book, Mexicans in Wisconsin. I'll start with the first. The first is that when we talk about Mexican immigration to the United States, we often focus our attention nationally on the border region. We usually talk about states like Texas, like Arizona, like California, Nevada, and our concentration about Mexican immigration often ends in those border states, in the places where people either arrive from Mexico or in places where people of Mexican descent have called home for generations, perhaps even before those states were part of the United States in the 19th century. For those of us, however, who are part of the communities here in Wisconsin, part of the Mexican communities here in Wisconsin, we understand that the story is much more diverse. And so it's important for us to move the scope beyond just that focus on the border region to other parts of the country, including here in the Midwest. Now that's kind of the larger reasons why I wrote it, but that doesn't really answer why I personally wrote the book. Well, I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been working on my dissertation in the History Department for 6 years now, and I'm hoping to graduate in a few months, so I'm almost done. I'll take any of your prayers, your well wishes, anything you have, bendiciones, anything you got, I'll take them. Please, please. And my research broadly as a historian, as a doctoral candidate, looks at the development of Milwaukee's Latino community throughout the 20th century. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to that subject. When I first came to graduate school in 2012, when you become a doctoral candidate, you have to decide what it is that you're going to study. You kind of have to plant your flag, and you have to say, over the next 6 years, I'm going to devote my life to this. And it better be something you love, because it's 6 years of reading and writing and reading and writing and revising, and being told you're a terrible writer. You have to really love it, because it is slightly masochistic. And I decided that I wanted to study where I came from. I'm originally from the Milwaukee area. Both of my parents are from Mexico, from the state of Jalisco. And I wanted to know why it is that Mexican people came to Wisconsin, number one, but why it is that they decided to stay here of all places. Right? You're just telling me how cold it is out there. So I want to tell you about my first archival trip. When you're a doctoral student, when you're a historian, you live in the archives. The archives are the boxes, all of the things, all of the paraphernalia, the material goods that tell the stories of people, of organizations, of movements. And so on my first archival trip to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, I went to the archivist and I said, I want to see everything you have on Mexicans in Wisconsin. And usually when you make that request, they say, we got 20 boxes for you to look through. It's going to take you years. And the archivist said, here is the folder.
Oh.
That was it.
One folder?
That was it. That's all they had saved. But in that folder, here's what I found. This is from the Milwaukee Journal, 1987. This is me in my parents' arms.
Oh.
See, that's why I do it. I do it for the awe, right? Now I got you hooked for the rest of the talk. Does anybody know where this is?
The Milwaukee Courthouse?
Nope, not the Milwaukee Courthouse.
The museum.
Nope, not the museum.
The library.
Mm-mm.
A church.
That's right.
Oh.
Anybody know which church? Anybody know Milwaukee? That's it, Guadalupe. So this is Our Lady of Guadalupe on the south side, right near Milwaukee Boys Tech, right off of National Avenue. This is me and my parents' arm. I am just a few months old. I was born in April. This is taken in July. And it's not often that as a historian you literally find yourself in the archives. And there I was on my first trip. But what this discovery really did for me is made real kind of these feelings I had been having for some time and wanting to understand why it is that Mexican communities came to Wisconsin, and just as importantly, how they built community. How did they find a way to connect with each other and with other places here in Wisconsin? And so as a guiding principle, I looked at the question of the pulse of Hispanic Milwaukee. What does it mean that the Milwaukee Journal is saying the pulse of Hispanic Milwaukee are these families walking out of a church on a Sunday morning? And so I focus specifically on institutions like churches, like baseball teams, like grocery stores, as places where people build community, as places where people come together. So this is very much a personal story for me. Very much a personal story, but I try to place myself within the larger context of Mexican immigration to this state. All right, so before we get started, I want to give you guys a test. It's not graded. I'm a graduate assistant, which means I do a lot of grading. I see the kids, don't worry, there's no grades or anything like that. But it's just 2 quick questions to test what we know about Mexican immigration to Wisconsin. Can we do that?
Sure.
Okay, all right, I appreciate it. All right, so here's the first question for you. When did the first Latino immigrants settle in Wisconsin? You have 4 options: 1848, 1884, 1920, or 1945. So take a second, think about it. Turn to the person next to you or near you and whisper what you think it is. Okay, raise your hand if you think it's A, B, there's one over here, C, and D. The one brave gentleman in the front is correct. 1884 is the answer. So there are no prizes, I apologize, but good for you. The first recorded instance of a person of Latino descent settling in Wisconsin is a man by the name of Rafael Valles. Now, Rafael Valles is very different. His story is very different from the stories we're going to hear about today. Rafael Valles was a classically trained musician. He was from the state of Puebla in Mexico. In the 1880s, he was living in Mexico City, working as a violinist, when an American opera company made its way through Mexico. And they heard about this prodigious, very talented young man and asked him to play with them at their opera concert in Mexico City. And he was so good that when they finished their tour, they invited Rafael to come along with them to the United States. He was a man who had never imagined coming to the United States, but he grabbed this opportunity. And for some strange reason, we haven't found out why, Rafael Valles decided to settle here in southeast Wisconsin. He settled in Milwaukee. And in Milwaukee, he became the choir director and the organist for some of the largest churches and synagogues in the city. He became Marquette University's first Latino professor at the turn of the century. He's a professor of music. He became involved in democratic politics at the turn of the century as well. He married a German-American woman. They had children, and they lived a life here. But his story is different, because while Rafael arrives in the 1880s, it's a few decades until more Mexican immigrants arrive in the city. So for those of you who had answered the 1920s, you're partially correct as well, because that's when we first started to see a larger movement. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. Okay, second question. How many Latinos currently live in Wisconsin? Our options are 50,000, 145,000, 340,000, and 500,000. So turn to the person next to you, whisper what you think it is. All right, raise your hand if you think it's A, 50,000, B, 145,000, C, 340,000, and D, 500,000. Okay, it's a trick question, because if you answered C, you're correct, but if you answered D, you're also kind of correct. Let me tell you why. That 340,000 number comes off of the last census, 2010. And you guys know, of course, we're almost near our next census, the 2020 census. And demographers believe that we're probably closer to 500,000 at this point. Now, one of the things I want to point out is this dramatic growth that has happened in the last few decades. You see, in 1980, there were about 63,000 Latinos in the state of Wisconsin. In 1990, 93,000. And then all of a sudden, something happens in the 1990s that spurs this dramatic growth of Latino populations across the state, going from 93 to nearly 200,000. And of course, now we're closer to 500,000. Any guesses on what happens in the 1990s?
A lot of births.
Not Reagan. A lot of births. Well,
And they came over they migrated over to Wisconsin.
They migrated to Wisconsin. Any reason, any guesses on why people are migrating to Wisconsin? Jobs, partially, yeah. So there are a lack of jobs in Latin American countries and more jobs in the United States. And it's often caused by free trade policy that the United States passes. So you may have heard of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. NAFTA's passed in the early 1990s. It decimates many Latin American countries, specifically Mexico's corn industry, and forces people to leave their fields, leave their farms, and come to the United States in search of labor. Now, one of the things I really want to emphasize today is the diversity of Latino experiences. The book...
Interrupt.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, the people that are there, are those like, do they count like the migrant workers that are just there for a while and then go back?
So that's a great question. In fact, by the late 20th century, there aren't as many migrant workers in Wisconsin. And we'll talk a little bit about that today in the 1960s and 70s. It's a great question. Yeah, it's whoever considers Wisconsin their home state. This home state, yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things I want to emphasize today is that the book I wrote is called Mexicans in Wisconsin. It's not called Latinos in Wisconsin. And the reason it's not called Latinos in Wisconsin is because there isn't a book called Europeans of Wisconsin. There are books called Germans and Poles and Italians and Scandinavians, but there is not a book called Latinos in Wisconsin. I'm hoping that in the future, other historians come forward and write the book of Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Salvadorans in Wisconsin. What we can see here is that while the majority of Wisconsin's Latino population is of Mexican descent, about 73%, there's a very large Puerto Rican population here in Wisconsin, about 14%, and then a smattering of different nationalities and ethnic backgrounds as well. In the 1960s, that number was actually closer to 60-40 split in places like Milwaukee, so 60% Mexican, 40% Puerto Rican. The number of Puerto Rican migrants and settlers in Wisconsin has dropped a bit over the last few years, and those from Mexico have risen. Now, what we'll not talk about as much today, because I'm a historian, but it's important for us to emphasize here, is that this population is booming. It's growing everywhere in Wisconsin. So if you can't see in the back, I'll try to give you some of the numbers. The top two rows demonstrate places you would imagine Latinos are settling. So Brown County, that's Green Bay, Kenosha, Milwaukee, there's Racine, and Dane County. Those are the areas of large settlement of Mexican and Latino descent populations. So we look over here, is Milwaukee County where the majority of Latinos live. We see a growth from 2010 to 2014 from 117,000 to 136,000. That's a large growth, right? Well, we kind of expected in urban centers here in Wisconsin. What is new, however, is the growth of Latino population in rural centers, in rural areas. Does anybody know where Trempealeau County is? Trempealeau is on the western part of the state near the Mississippi River, southwestern part of the state. A place that you couldn't find Latinos for most of the 20th century. In 1990, there were only 53 Latinos in that part of the state. Now, there are over 2,000. 2,000, right? So the question we have to ask ourselves as academics, but also as members of our state's communities, is what does it mean for the people who already live in Trempealeau County to have these large population growths of a population that was pretty foreign to them before? But also, what does it mean to people of Latino descent who are settling there? Are people building community, or are they not? And if they're not, what are the reasons for that? So we're going to ask some of those questions here today. Now, I've got about a half hour to do 100 years of history with you. That's not nearly enough time. So if I skip over something, you want to know something more, just try to save it so I can run through these 30 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll ask those questions at the end. Does that sound okay? Okay, all right. So now I mentioned that Rafael Valles was the first person of Latino descent to settle here in Wisconsin in the 1880s. But from the 1880s to the 1910s, there wasn't much movement here to Wisconsin. There wasn't things drawing people here. However, in the early 1920s, there are shifts that happen all across the United States that propel people from Mexico to places like Wisconsin. So we have images here of Waukesha, Latinos who arrive to work in the beet farms surrounding the Waukesha area. Migrant workers many times who come from Texas, but also from Mexico, coming to work in agricultural business. And there is a small amount that is happening, a small amount of demographic shifts or a small amount of migration coming from these regions in the first few decades of the 20th century. However, in the early 1920s, something happens. At the federal level, the legislators, the congressional legislators, make the decision to cut off immigration from Europe. So they passed two sets of immigration laws in 1921 and 1924. And these immigration laws have the effect of basically halting all immigration from Europe, specifically from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the passage of those laws were directly affected by this sense of anxiety in the United States. As more and more immigrants were coming from Europe to settle into the United States, Americans became startled with the prospect of having to integrate these people into their communities. These people spoke a different language, they had different cultures, some of them were racially or skin color different from people who lived in the United States. And so in the 1920s, federal legislators made the decision to cut off immigration from Europe. Now, if you're a business, what problem does that pose for you?
Workers.
That's right. So when these legislators passed these laws in 1921 and 1924, businesses made sure that there was a loophole built into those laws. While immigration was cut off from Europe, it was left wide open from Latin America. Wide open. So there were no limits placed on the number of people who could come from Latin America. So beginning in the 1920s, we see a large growth of Latino descent population, specifically from Mexico, coming to the United States. And it happens in places like Milwaukee. So in Milwaukee, tanneries and foundries depended on low-skilled, low-wage laborers from Europe. And when that got cut off, they looked to Mexico. So one example here is the Pfister and Vogel Tannery Company. In the early 1920s, the Pfister and Vogel Tannery Company sent recruiters to Mexico. They call these recruiters in Mexico enganchistas. Enganchar means to hook, right? So these labor recruiters are going down to the central states of Mexico to hook workers and bring them back to the United States. Now here's what they would do. They would arrive in Mexico and they would have contracts written up. And these contracts would be for 6 months, right? 6-month contracts. And they would go to young men in Mexico who didn't have many economic opportunities following the Mexican Revolution. And they would say, sign this contract, come up to Milwaukee, work for 6 months, and when you've made some money, you can go back home and be with your family with your pocket full of cash. And that sounded pretty good for young men, right? What contract was that language written in?
English.
You guessed exactly right. It was written in English. So these young men signed these contracts, young men like you see here in the corner. And they get on the trains heading from the central states of Mexico, from Michoacán, from Jalisco, from Aguascalientes. And they would arrive at the train depot in Milwaukee, excited for this opportunity to work a little bit, make a little bit of cash, and go back to their families. Who was waiting for them at the train depot, though? But European workers with bats in their hands. Now, here's the thing that these workers hadn't been told by the companies. They were being recruited as strikebreakers, as scabs. For those of you who know Milwaukee history, Milwaukee was one of the most unionized cities in the country in the early 20th century. And as unionized workforces fought for better working conditions and better wages, companies, instead of negotiating with them, they would just go get labor from Mexico. So literally, the first interaction that the majority of Mexicans have with the city is being called job takers. They're here to take our jobs. So if you hear that rhetoric today, it has a precedent that goes back 100 years. Not a great interaction, not a great first start for Mexican immigrants arriving here in Wisconsin. Well, the thing about the jobs that these Mexican men were getting was that they were paid very well. And so instead of staying for 6 months, many of them would stay for 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or 4 years. They would take extended stays in the United States. And as these men stayed in Wisconsin, all of a sudden Milwaukee communities, Wisconsin communities had to decide, are we going to integrate these people into our communities, or are we going to push them out? Are they going to be considered Milwaukeeans and Wisconsinites, or are we going to treat them as foreigners? Well, you can guess what the answer was. In the 1930s, I'll show you an example of how Mexicans were perceived by the larger Milwaukee community. In 1930, the YWCA, International Institute, sent a social worker into the south side of Milwaukee where most Mexicans lived. And her job was to find out, what are these Mexicans like? What are they doing? How are they integrating? And her report said this: do you know how intimate an American problem the Mexican has become? So by 1930, Mexicans in Milwaukee who had been recruited here to prop up the city's labor are now seen as a problem to be solved. So the social worker, Agnes Fenton, who prepared this report, she did all of these interviews with police officers and teachers and social workers in the city to get a feel on whether or not Mexicans could be integrated, and if they couldn't be, why. And I just want to show you a quick excerpt on what she published in her report. This is what one section reads. While the social workers are afraid the peons is a derogatory word for low skill or low wage worker, will not mix with our native-born population, the eugenicists are afraid that they will. It is certain that interbreeding cannot be prevented. That might be considered a happy ending if the quality of our racial stock were not lowered in the process. If the stock of the Mexican is as good as ours, there can be no scientific objection. But there are, however, competent and impartial observers who consider the peon inferior to the whites, both physically and mentally. So what is the fear? What is the fear that Agnes Fenton, that this social worker, is pointing out? What is the fear?
Interracial relationships.
Interracial relationships, intermixing. The word is miscegenation, right? This idea that Mexican men are going to get involved with Milwaukee's white women. That is the fear. 1930, we're not talking about 19th century US South. We're talking about here in Wisconsin in the 1930s. This seems like a pretty dire situation, but I'll tell you what. If in Mexico the Mexican Revolution has ravaged the nation and there aren't jobs for people, even with these circumstances, people are going to continue to come to Milwaukee. And so, those single Mexican men who would first arrive in the 1920s began calling for their families to join them in Milwaukee. So, for example, in 1910, there were fewer than 50 foreign-born Mexicans in the city of Milwaukee, fewer than 50. By 1920, there were over 3,000. And by 1929, there was almost 7,000 Mexican people living in the city of Milwaukee. And included a wide assortment of people, families, single men, widowed women, of all varieties of families living here in Wisconsin. And they settled in the Walker's Point neighborhood, right around the factories in which they lived, and they tried their best to make community. Now, obviously, if the city wasn't going to accept them, as we see with Agnes Fenton's report, Mexicans had to find a way to make community for themselves. And they did so. They made mutual aid societies, like La Sociedad Mutualista Hispano-Azteca. And these mutual aid societies fulfilled a number of different roles. They provided insurance, both death insurance or hospital insurance. They provided a form of fellowship through national celebrations. So here you see a Cinco de Mayo festival. And one of the really interesting things about these images is that you see that they're celebrating different types of national origin, of connection. So you see the American flag in the back, even though they're people of Mexican descent. You have the Mexican flag in the corner, and in the middle you have a standard for La Virgen de Guadalupe. And what these people are trying to do is to declare their space in Milwaukee, to say that, yes, we are of Mexican descent, but we also want to be something else. We desire to be a part of this community. They made their own sports teams. So of course, this is, the best name for a baseball team, the Friends, right? Los Amigos Baseball Club. And they made their own religious institutions. So you remember that church? My parents walking out of that church with me in their arms? Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Mission Chapel is founded in 1926. It's first founded in a small storefront. But they do their best to make it look anything like a storefront. They make it look like an actual chapel. So this early Mexican community cannot look outward for support. They cannot look outward for community. They've been denied that opportunity. So instead, they turn inward and create their own community institutions. Now, this is one example of Mexican migration that happens in the early 20th century. We have a question about migrant workers. Beginning in the 1940s and 1950s, we have another large group of migrants coming to Wisconsin. Now, these people are not immigrants, they're migrants. The majority of these people are Texas-born Mexicans, or Tejanos. Many people who can trace their family's lineage to Texas, even before Texas was a state of the United States. Now, these Tejanos are recruited to work in any sort of agriculture you can think of in Wisconsin. Sugar beets, snap peas, corn, cherries, anything and everything you can think of, Mexican descent hands were picking in the 1940s and 1950s. Beginning in 1947, most Wisconsin farmers stopped hiring Wisconsin hands because many of them have moved into the city after World War II. and they turned to hiring Tejano workers. 15,000 Tejanos per year, imagine this, 15,000 Tejanos per year in the 1950s migrated to Wisconsin to work in the growing and the harvest seasons. So every single year, 15,000 families, 15,000 members of families, Tejano families, would jump in their trucks and their trains and come up to Wisconsin to work in Wisconsin's different industries. Now, you might not be surprised to learn that the reception that they get in the rural parts of the state are not that different from the reception that those first Mexican descent people got in the 1920s in Milwaukee. I want to show you one example of what this looked like. In 1949, in Waupun, anybody know where Waupun is? Central Wisconsin, right? Waupun. In 1949 in Waupun, a Tejano family went to a local park to cool off during the hot July summer. They went to the local pool and took their children with the expectation of being able to spend the day at the pool and cool off. The park custodian refused them entry into the pool, saying that because they were Mexican and because they spoke Spanish, they did not deserve entry into the pool. We're talking again about 1949 Wisconsin, not 1920s US South, a form of segregation and discrimination happening in the fields simply because of these people's ethnic heritage and because of the language they spoke. Now, that custodian who denied these people entry, can you imagine what happened to him? No, he was fired immediately. He was fired. Now, why do you think he was fired immediately?
They didn't want a riot?
That's partially it. They didn't want something. Yeah.
Everyone's created equal according to the Constitution.
If it was only that wonderful. It wasn't. There was actually a deeper motive for this. The city and the state was worried that this form of discrimination was going to get down to Texas. And if people heard in Texas that they treated Tejanos this way, they wouldn't come up to work. So in 1949, the Mexican federal government actually sanctions Wisconsin and refuses to send braceros or Mexican descent workers to come and work in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is put on a blacklist for a few years, along with Texas and Louisiana, not states you want to be on a blacklist with regarding labor violations, okay? Interestingly enough, Milwaukee newspapers like the Milwaukee Journal believe that with just a little bit with a few fiestas held in the county with some of these children, the problem can be solved. And so in 1950, actually, the Milwaukee Journal says, we solved the problem, racial discrimination has ended in central Wisconsin. I appreciate the laughter because you're right, it wasn't over. In 1950, the state of Wisconsin, the governor actually creates a special commission to investigate what's happening in migrant fields. And they publish a report in June of 1950 called A Problem in Human Rights. And here's what part of the report says. The successful assimilation of the migrant worker and his family into the community to which he has come presents virtually the same problems as the acceptance into the community of other minority groups. Having migrated in order to better his economic status, he is often disillusioned to find that he has no friends, no familiarity with the culture outside of his own group. The reason that the treatment of migrant workers is the problem for the state of Wisconsin is because it poses an economic risk to the state's health. And so, over the next few years, over the 1950s, different state commissions tried to better the circumstances of migrant workers. But every single time they try to better the circumstances, they're stopped by growers and canners who feel that if they appease a little bit, if they give a little bit on wages, if they give a little bit on living and working conditions, workers will keep taking and taking and taking. And so the condition for migrant workers throughout the 1950s remained terrible. Let me show you what those look like. Here's 1969. Here's an example of what a bathing unit looked like. This is what sanitation facilities look like in central Wisconsin. This is in Watoma labor camp in 1969. So the inside of a sanitation facility. And this is actually one of the better ones because they had running water. Because by the late 1960s, many migrant camps were still without running water, without proper disposal units. Some of the units that people lived in were just excess barracks from World War II. And the circumstances are obviously pretty dire. So you can imagine what it must have been like one of those 15,000 Tejano migrants, children, husbands and wives, grandparents making their way to Wisconsin every year to work in the fields. and what the opportunities they must have had for them to continue to come up here, right? It gets so bad that in 1969, the senator of Wisconsin, Senator Gaylord Nelson, who's probably known best for being the founder of Earth Day, he was also a champion for migrant rights. In July of 1969, Senator Gaylord Nelson comes to the floor of the Senate and he delivers an address called The Future of Brown America. And he says in part, Mexican Americans are tired of waiting to be granted their full and unqualified rights as American citizens. This is Wisconsin Senator recognizing that the situation cannot stand because something is going to tip. And of course something does tip. So raise your hand if you're familiar with Cesar Chavez. Right? Most people know Chavez and the migrant farm workers in California. In the mid-1960s, they organized themselves into a labor union and they marched for their rights. Well, that was happening here in Wisconsin as well. In 1966, a young man named Jesus Salas, and you see Jesus right here, 22 years old, young man, he's younger than me, right? Jesus Salas organizes migrant farm workers into a union. And Jesus's family, the Salas family, had been coming to Wisconsin for decades to work in the migrant fields. They had settled in Watoma. And they organized themselves for what they call a march for respectability. Because yes, they wanted higher wages. Yes, they wanted better working conditions. But most importantly, they wanted their dignity as human beings. And so in this march, you see a few different images. You see the American flag because they're demanding their rights as American citizens. You see the Thunderbird, which is the image of Cesar Chavez's and Dolores Huerta's United Farm Workers. Now, this story is fantastic, how this group of migrant workers came to take on this image. I've sat down with Jesus a few times, and he told me that when he wanted to use this image, but this is 1966, it's the beginning of the migrant farm worker movement. He's never met Chavez before. So what he does is he picks up the phone. Some of you might remember this. He picks up the phone and he asks the operator. This is back in the day, right? He says, "Operator, California." All right, so they put him through to California. Operator Delano, right? Where that's where Chavez is from. And then operator Cesar Chavez. So he just cold calls Cesar Chavez in 1966. And Chavez picks up the phone and Salas says to him, "Mr. Chavez, can I use your Thunderbird image in my March for Migrant Rights?" And Chavez says, "Sure, go for it." And that was how this motley crew of migrant farm workers, hundreds of miles away from California, came to adopt an image that became central to the migrant farm worker movement across the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. And the third image they take on is La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? The patroness mother of Mexico. So in 1966, these migrant farm workers march from Watoma to Madison for their march for respectability. And they form a labor union called Obreros Unidos, or Workers United. This labor union isn't completely successful. Many of the companies they're fighting against just make the decision to leave the state. They just stop planting here and go to different parts of the United States instead of bargaining over wages. But what we see in the middle parts of Wisconsin, this form of activism eventually makes its way to other parts of Wisconsin. In Milwaukee, young Latinos of different national background, Puerto Rican and Mexican American, joined together with poor white and poor black Milwaukeeans to fight under a shared inter-ethnic banner for better economic policies, for better treatment from the police, for better treatment from their government. Now, I love this picture for a number of different reasons. This is from 1971. What do we see in this picture before I tell you what I see? What do you see in this picture?
Different races.
What's that? Different races, that's right. So you see black, brown, and white faces all together there. What else do we see? Different languages, right? So poor people make poor targets. This is an anti-police brutality march on the south side of Milwaukee. Over there you see afuera los pistoleros de Breyer. So out with the gunmen of Police Chief Breyer. What was that I heard in the back? Youth, that's right. These are young faces. These are babies. These are children. The movement was led by young people. Black and brown and white faces, inter-ethnic, interlinguistic, led by youth with many different targets. And they marched. So most of us are familiar with the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, but the Chicano and the Latino Civil Rights Movement of that period was vibrant as well here in Wisconsin. Here they are marching across the viaduct in Milwaukee, marching for their community's rights. They occupy spaces, right? So in 1970, they occupy the office of the Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, because in the late 1960s and early 1970s, some of these activists tell me you could fit all the black and brown students around one table at UW-Milwaukee. And so in the late 1960s, these students reasonably presented their plans to the Chancellor of UW-Milwaukee and said, could we get a few more spots for Latino students, for black students here at UW-Milwaukee? And they were pushed to the side. And so eventually, they made a decision. They just took over the office of the Chancellor. And their protests, although being, thrown into jail a few times, their protests were eventually successful. Because from that 1970 protest, UW-Milwaukee founds the Spanish-speaking Outreach Institute, which is today known as the Roberto Hernandez Center at UW-Milwaukee. And of course, we see the growth of communities across the state as well. So here in Racine, we see the growth of a community. I'll make sure I get my numbers right. That's the Malacara family, yeah? Yeah, all right, so we see the Malacara family, right? In Racine, we have a community that grows mostly because of many of those migrant workers that we had talked about before. When the companies start to leave the fields, there are less jobs in the fields. And Tejanos, instead of going back south to Texas, they end up moving into the cities here in Milwaukee, Kenosha, Racine, Appleton, the Green Bay area, and Madison. So here in Racine, although there have been Latinos living in Racine since the 1930s, the largest growth of Latinos here in Racine of Mexican descent people really comes in the early 1970s, as many of those migrant families move out of the fields and move into the cities. So there were about 8,000 people of Mexican descent by the late 1960s and early 1970s. That's a pretty big number, right? Again, from a small population to a little bit larger. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, that Mexican descent population continues to grow. And now, what we see, instead of communities necessarily just looking inward, looking to build their mutual aid societies, their individual baseball teams, their small mission chapels, we see communities pushing outward. Those marches that we saw in the 1960s and 1970s represented an effort to stamp a public presence in Wisconsin, to say that we will not be hidden, we will not be told that we are different, we will claim our space here in the state. And I think the loudest example, the most prominent example of this, are cultural celebrations like Mexican Fiesta that happens every late August down at the Summerfest grounds in Milwaukee. And we see these every single day now in church festivals, in ways that people occupy space through their music, through their art, through their cultural celebrations. These are all ways that people are claiming their sense of belonging here in the state of Wisconsin. Now, I told you that there have been these large dramatic shifts in demography and population shifts here in Wisconsin within the Latino population. So this is 1990, the Latino population according to the census. And you wouldn't be surprised to see that the largest populations are, in the southeast counties down here. And you see Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, Waukesha, and then of course Dane, Madison, right? Those are the ones you would expect. And you see a smattering of populations. Most of these are people who moved out of the fields and moved into surrounding areas. So you see them in places like Stevens Point and Appleton, large communities. What does that look like today, though? So of course you still see the same populations here, but now you see big populations in Brown County, up in Green Bay, down along the border here, and growing populations almost everywhere along the state. So I'll show that again. This is 1990. And here we are today.
What's that island by map? The little one, right? No, down that. What's that?
It's a great question. We'll have to look it up. Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Okay.
I gotta get my geography down better a little bit at
I
state.
was just curious.
That's a
I thought
great question.
That's odd because it's completely surrounded.
You're right, there's less than 500 people of Latino descent living there.
They must have a wall around there.
There must be something. We'll have to look that up. That's a great question.
It's like Watertown or Johnson's,
Something.
Jefferson.
So we have this large growth, 1990 to 2014. And the question we have to ask ourselves as people living here in Racine, people living in Madison, perhaps where there have been Latinos for quite some time. Again, I'll return to this question. What does it mean for those communities in those small spaces, in those rural counties, that now have these very dramatic population shifts? What does it mean for people of Mexican descent arriving there? But what does it mean for Wisconsinites who have lived there for generations? And we can see one hint on how this is playing out. We can see it in our national politics today. The way that people of Mexican descent, people of Latino descent, are being talked about and are being treated. And we could, of course, point to Washington and say, well, this is a political issue that's happening at the federal level. But for any of us who follow statewide politics, we know what happens right here in this state as well today. So, for example, 2 years ago, in February of 2016, legislators at the Wisconsin State House made the decision to bring 2 pieces of legislation forward. These pieces of legislation would have sanctioned, would have penalized those communities that refuse to force public employees to become immigration officers. Fines of $5,000 a day for those communities that refuse to engage in immigration and customs enforcement. The language we hear today, you might be familiar with the term sanctuary cities or sanctuary municipalities. These 2 pieces of legislation were brought to the Assembly floor in February of 2016. But they were beaten down. They were beaten down again in 2017, and they were beaten down 2 weeks ago in 2018. Why were they beaten down, though? So there are 2 reasons. The first you see right in front of you. People power, right? Kind of the same protests we saw in the 60s and 70s. More than 20,000 people. I'm the guy right there with his fist up. More than 20,000 people coming to the Capitol to make one singular claim. We belong here. Regardless of documentation status, regardless of ethnic background, regardless of language, we belong here. This is a pretty powerful statement. Has anybody ever been inside the rotunda? It's marble. It's marble everywhere. So any sound echoes and reverberates. When you have 20,000 people inside of there making loud noises, it gets pretty loud. And this can be romantic and inspiring and make you feel good. But this isn't the only reason that these laws were not passed. Can anybody know why else these laws weren't passed? Economics, exactly. The other reason that these laws were not passed is because of the dairy industry here in Wisconsin. Now, the dairy industry in Wisconsin is the 2nd largest in the country, behind only California. And these farms depend on immigrant labor. More than 50% of hired help on large Wisconsin dairy operations is made up of immigrant labor, the majority of which is undocumented. So these farms depend on not migrant farm workers, because these people have to live on the farms 24/7, because there isn't a season for dairy farming. It's all year long. And so while the power of these individuals, these 20,000 immigrants and their allies taking the stage, may have seemed like the reason this law was defeated, one of the big reasons was because of the dairy industry. The dairy industry that picked up their phones and called their legislators and called the governor and said, if you pass this law, you will cripple this industry. Nationally, the loss of immigrant workers would mean rising milk prices, a 90% increase in milk prices, and a loss of $32 billion to the U.S. economy. $32 billion would be lost if undocumented workers were taken out of dairy industries. Economic interests play just as big of a role as the individual claims that people are making. Now, that's not the only fight, of course, that people of Latino descent, documented and undocumented, continue to face here in Wisconsin and across the United States. Those students, those young people who have status as dreamers, recipients of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, are fighting their own fight, asking the exact same questions that people in the 1920s were asking. Do I belong here? And if I don't, why? So of course, this Monday, March 5th, was the deadline that our current president placed on the end of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, the DACA program. And the only reason that it wasn't phased out, the only reason that we aren't seeing mass deportations of these young people, is because federal courts placed that decision on hold. There are about 8,000 young people here in Wisconsin who have DACA. 8,000. And you might think to yourself, well, this is a complicated issue. immigration, oh, it's a hot third rail. If you touch it, whew, you're going to get controversy. But there was a poll that came out this week from the Marquette University Law School. And here's what the Marquette University Law School poll said. Most Wisconsin voters, 71%, support a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who have deferred action. 71%. Pardon me, no, that's a lie. 71% for all undocumented immigrants, regardless if they're DACA recipients or not. 71% of Wisconsin voters believe that undocumented people in this state, regardless of their citizenship status, regardless of their access to DACA, deserve a pathway to citizenship. For those people who have DACA, 86% of Wisconsinites believe they should have a pathway to citizenship. So the question shouldn't seem that difficult, right? So the question I want to leave to us, hopefully we can have in this conversation in the next few minutes, is why it is that people of Mexican descent, of Latino descent in 2018, in 1970, in 1950, 1920, continue to face many of the same barriers. And those barriers are fundamentally the same thing. Do I belong in this state? And do I consider myself a Wisconsinite? At the end of the day, people from those communities themselves are making a claim with a loud voice. And the answer is yes, yes I do. Thank you. So we got time for questions. One and then two, yes.
Okay. As a citizen of non-Latino descent,
Mhm.
I have a Heinz 57 in my lineage.
Okay,
So I am a walking,
I love ketchup.
yeah, I'm a walking conglomeration of immigrants. But by now we, for generations, have been all Americans.
Mhm.
Why is it that I'm finding it difficult to take part in the marches and the protests and the very vivid movement of things like immigration? Because I hear about it in the news the day of the event or the day after the event, and I'm like, I would go with my walker and my dumb dog, and I would stand and make up some of those numbers. And there are people that would stand with me because we're right, we believe in more than the DACA, the young people that have never known a nation but this as home, but the people who have called this home for generations and never gotten to. Grandma was never a citizen, Dad was never a citizen, and now I'm in my 50s and 60s and I have grandchildren, and I don't know if I'll ever be a citizen. That's where you call home. You should have every right to all of the laws, the good and the bad, that the rest of the humanity has to follow in that country. I lived in Venezuela for a year. They didn't go, oh, poor you, you're American, you don't speak Spanish? Guess what? If you want a bathroom in this town, you better learn how to get there. And if you don't want a bathroom, stay home. And then they said to me, you think you have rights? You're nobody. And I went, I've been here a year. And they went, you're nobody. But then I looked at my aunt and uncle who lived there 20 years. And they were missionaries. And they could not have the rights that the other Venezuelans could have. Because their skin was white. Their birth certificate said the United States. And I went, but you've been here for 20 years. You have followed all of the rules. You have paid everything you need to pay. You've greased the hands you need to grease, and you've washed the hands you need to wash, and you have survived in this land for 20, and you can't
So
do things?
let's pull it back to Wisconsin. So you're,
How do I stand with my fellow Americans?
That's- yeah.
These are not, to me, these are not people that are folks that you have to, oh, there's an undocumented worker. No, these are my fellow Americans.
So I think that's a fantastic.
And I want to be able to join beforehand instead of, oh, Well, they had that march at Milwaukee County Courthouse.
I hear you.
Well,
So,
isn't that nice?
so the question is how to become engaged before and not after, or during, right? Wonderful. So, we're fortunate here in Wisconsin that we have a number of organizations that are actively engaged in immigrant right justice work. I think the most prominent one is a Milwaukee-born but now transplanted to all parts of the state, Voces de la Frontera. And Voces de la Frontera has a very active movement here in Racine, one of the most active in the state. They have a new branch just opened up in Madison, my home. When I was younger, that's where I started my immigrant activism in the 1990s. And it's as easy as plugging into their Facebook page and just paying attention to their publications.
But if you don't speak Spanish, you don't know what that means.
They publish everything in English and Spanish because they understand, like many immigrant rights groups, that it's important to not just build bridges within the community, but to other communities as well.
So
And
you can actually Google.
Yep,
Hispanic
absolutely.
Activism.
Voces de la Frontera. Voces de la Frontera. There are other organizations, local churches that are engaged in immigrant justice work. As I mentioned, my work looks at religion as a place for community formation, and so churches, the Catholic Church, and different Protestant and Jewish denominations have been engaged in immigrant justice work for decades now. Those are other places to look. But I think one of the problems that we face is sometimes we get fatigued with all of the marches, and we get fatigued with all of the work that has to be done. There you go. All right, some promotional material. It's sometimes just a matter of plugging in once, and then it's there for you. So hopefully that helps. Yeah.
There's
So
also the Racine Interfaith Coalition.
the Racine Interfaith Coalition.
They are really involved in immigration rights, so that's also one of the resources is the Racine Interfaith Coalition on
Okay.
Vulcan Avenue.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Next question up here. Yes, ma'am.
I'm confused about the rotunda.
Yes.
What was that about,
So what was this march against?
or for?
Or for or against? It was against two pieces of legislation that were largely seen as anti-immigrant. Piece of legislation that would have penalized those municipalities, so cities or counties, that did not agree to work with immigration and customs enforcement. In other words, those cities that said, we're not going to use our resources to detain and deport individuals living within our jurisdiction, those places would have been penalized at least $5,000 a day for not executing those actions.
And the,
Mhm.
right, and the reason the dairy people,
The reason that dairy people were opposed to those laws is because the majority of labor is undocumented labor. And so if local municipalities now were forced to act as immigration and customs enforcement, they would be taking away their labor from their dairy operations.
okay, so it was rural communities too, not just these big sanctuary city.
No, that's right.
things.
That's right. So the people you see here, you might assume they're all Madisonians, but most of them are from around surrounding suburbs and surrounding rural areas.
So that's misleading sanctuary cities
That's
because
right.
they're operating in non-large urban areas too.
Well, that's a great point. The entire concept of sanctuary cities is extremely misleading. It's a loaded term that doesn't really do justice to the larger question. The reason that the idea of sanctuary cities is not one that's very viable or it's really muddy is because, if the city of Milwaukee or the city of Racine passes a law that says our public employees do not have to interact with immigration and customs enforcement, the second an individual walks outside of a county line or outside of a city line, they're in the jurisdiction of another police force, another sheriff's office, right? So now they're outside of that protection, that so-called protection. So
It didn't pass then,
it didn't pass then, it didn't pass this year.
but now the federal situation is trying to push this.
Right, so we're seeing the fight kind of on different levels. At the state level, it has been stopped
They're
for 3
trying
years.
to push into the states.
That's right,
That-
that's right. So that was literally yesterday,
Yeah.
we saw that, yes. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Maria Morales. I'm with LULAC and Racine Faith Coalition. And I've been working first with immigrants and since like the 60s. And before that with migrants and with welfare mothers. But I see the immigrant issue as a tyrant issue. It's like all worn out. And I would like to see it instead booked as a civil rights issue because that actually is what it is.
Yeah.
How would we go about and calling it what it is?
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic point. Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois called immigration rights the civil rights issue of our generation. The idea that you know, the most public face is the face of these dreamers, but they're just one story that's being told. There are many other stories. The dreamers themselves, of course, say that the original dreamers were their parents, were the ones who came here first to find a better life for themselves and their families. And so I think it extends far beyond simply questions of documentation. We're seeing in the last few years this resurgent move within some sectors of the very, very, very far-right political sphere that is trying to recraft the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says those people who are born in the United States are American citizens. And so there are people in this country who want to change that, who say that your birthright does not give you citizenship, right? So I think you're right. It's more than just an immigrant issue. It's a larger civil rights issue. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and the migrant workers were around Racine and everything, and that's when LULAC and UMOS and all those came in to support and help.
Mm-hmm.
I never once, growing up, thought of people being illegal or undocumented. That wasn't talked about then. Or that they didn't belong here. Yeah, they were migrants, but it was a sense of having to put your arms around people who were living in less than ideal circumstances and help them and all that. And in all the time I've lived, I've never, that's happening now, while they may not have been immediately integrated into majority communities, communities accepted people. People found places to live, they paid rent, they paid taxes, they were given jobs, they brought relatives here, they went over the border fluidly and came back. We let people come here, take root, become part of this country, and now we're supposed to rip them out and throw them back somewhere?
I appreciate the passion. And I think we see this very dramatic shift, and anytime there are large movements of people in American history, we see a backlash. So I mentioned the 1920s as the passage of these laws that cut off immigration from Europe. Those laws were passed because of a large growth of European immigrants arriving in the United States. And so it's important for us as historians to think of this in a larger context. When we talk about the 60s and 70s, one of the differences in the growth of those populations was that many of those people were American citizens. They were Tejanos, which means that they were Texas-born, Mexican descent individuals and families. What we saw starting in the 1970s and the 1980s, and specifically from the 80s to the 90s, was a large growth of undocumented population. And so as people in places like Mexico and Central America found that there weren't enough spots for them to come legally into the United States, the circumstances, the economic circumstances in their home countries were so dire, there were no opportunities for them, that they made the decision to cross the border or to overstay a visa outside of the bounds of the law, because the opportunities that would be available for them and their family would be better.
They were allowed. They were allowed to stay. Nobody was chasing people down. They were hired by companies I worked in human resources for. Nobody was,
But I'll just clarify this again, that in the 60s and 70s, there was not a very large undocumented population in Wisconsin. Even in the 70s and 80s, it's not until the 80s that we see the large growth of an undocumented population
but
here in
the
Wisconsin.
undocumented people are working.
They were and they weren't.
companies.
So again, in 1986, Congress passes a law called the Immigration Reform and Control Act under President Reagan, and it offers amnesty. It gives amnesty to hundreds of thousands, millions of undocumented people. But it also imposes for the first time these very stringent limits on employers. And so it says employers have to check social security numbers, they have to verify that a person is an actual citizen. So beginning in 1986, it's a transformation of how people are being policed within immigration enforcement. And one of the things that I have to point out, I always point this out in a public talk, I think it's easy for us in 2018, in post-2016, to point to the current president as a reason that we have this immigration hysteria. It's easy for us to point to Washington right now and say the current set of administrators are the reason that things are so bad for immigrants. But the deportation machine at the fingertips of the current president was not created by President Trump. It was created by President Clinton in 1994. It was further expanded by President Bush in the 2000s. And it was exploded under President Obama. Under President Obama's term, more people were deported in those 8 years while he was in office than any other president in the history of the United States. President Obama, of course, earned the label of deporter-in-chief by most immigrant rights activists in the United States because of his very, very, very punitive policies against undocumented people. And so it's important for us to remember that in 2016, we see this large fear in undocumented communities. But that fear has been there for quite some time. It's a fear that immigrant rights groups like Voz de la Frontera, like the Interfaith Coalition here in Racine, have been fighting against for decades, not just since 2016. Yes?
I mean, kudos to the dairy farmers for, kind of finessing. What are the conditions, though, for undocumented men and women that live 24/7 on a dairy farm?
Yeah. It's a great question.
Terrible.
It's a great question.
I'm very
No, and I appreciate the question. So I guess in perspective, right, are they as bad as these conditions? No. Are they circumstances that anyone in this room would like to live under? No. No. It's there's a reason that many of these dairy industries and other industries look towards undocumented people to do this work. Because it's low wage and it's exploitable labor. Because when a person were to demand for higher wages or try to organize into a union, they could just be fired or reported to Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
And that's why the current situation developed. I mean, people were brought here deliberately.
Yeah,
they were allowed
that's right.
to stay, documented or undocumented, allowed to stay and exploited. And apparently that got out of hand in terms of I don't know what. And now, the thing to rip people out of their lives and their homes and their families or not allow grandparents and stuff, and it's just crazy.
Yeah.
Everybody benefits from this.
I'd agree with you. Other questions or comments or things we'd like to consider? It's a heavy topic. Yes, sir.
Going back into history,
Yes,
with the Great Black Migration in the 20s and 30s, and into this, it comes down to economic power. I think there was a study issued a week or two ago that indicated in the next 20 years, Caucasians will be a minority. And that's very frightening to the classic 35% of the people who don't have anybody else to beat on. But and when you talk about economic power and why this is happening, it's a fear of what is going to happen to their children in the future.
Yeah.
It seems to me that it's pretty straightforward in terms of what's going on. It's a big country. Everybody's welcome, right? But it depends on where. My grandparents came from Milan, Italy.
Yeah.
So before the clampdown on immigration, but they were assimilated into society.
Right.
And therefore, it's okay to be from heritage from Italy or Poland or wherever. Not so good to be from somewhere else.
That's right.
And there's that fear.
As a labor historian, I completely agree with you. Economic power is ultimately the driving force for a lot of these questions. It is, yeah. Yes,
Ask the Koch brothers.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
In Wisconsin, the exodus of the Mexicans of the 30s,
Yes.
Operation Wetback
Yep.
in the 50s, and the Suits before that.
Yes.
Is that also
Yes,
affecting
ma'am.
Wisconsin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I talk about this in the book that in the ninth. So I mentioned that in Milwaukee there are about 7,000 people of Mexican descent living here in the state. 7,000, right? By 1937, 1,500. 7,000 to 1,500. So for those of you who aren't familiar, during the Great Depression around the country, there was a large movement to deport. The word back then was repatriate. People of Mexican descent back to Mexico because of the dire economic circumstances in the United States. Anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million people of Mexican descent were sent back to Mexico. And the really terrible thing, of course, during that period was that a lot of those people were actually American citizens. They had been born here. Some people didn't even speak Spanish and never been to Mexico. A few years ago, the state of California actually issued an apology to its Mexican descent population for its actions during the 1930s.
What year was that?
In the 1930s. So here in Milwaukee, it happened as well. In the Racine and Kenosha area, it happened as well.
Okay, because we never heard that when my mother and my dad came over like in 1925, 26
Yeah.
or something, and they didn't have to be hiding or they didn't have to be worried about being
We were
deported.
lucky.
It wasn't everyone. It wasn't everyone. But I mean, again, the community here in Southeast Wisconsin was 7,000, decimated to 1,500 by the 1930s. So people were either forced to go back or they went back voluntarily themselves because there weren't economic opportunities here. Mexicans were usually in the 1920s the last hired, first fired in their jobs.
I was born in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
I was the first Hispanic child born in Racine.
Oh, really?
Yes.
All right. Celebrity in the room, I didn't even know.
But I mean, there was just a small group of people here, not too many families, mostly single people.
That's right.
And then later on, more came, and it was Waukegan,
Mhm.
and then Milwaukee.
That's right.
And that's where we would go, like for parties or dance or whatever. And then Utualista.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that, and our Lady of Guadalupe, that the chapel or the church, going there for kermeses, is that what it was called? The
Yeah,
church
kermeses.
festivals and
That's
all
right.
that. Yeah, I remember all that. But then it was more, it was to just maintain their heritage.
That's right.
I think it was that everybody got together and did stuff, and it was just really. Everybody got along with everybody. It wasn't, what do you call it? You know what I want to do? Your next book, I wanted to see.
Please tell me.
On education. How did these people start from nothing? That came and maybe their parents were illiterate or something, or some of them. How did some of these do? How did they advance? How many doctorates do we have? How many engineers do we have? You know, that started out like that. I think that would really make us feel good, our young people, if they could see all this, that all these people, whether they're Mexican or Puerto Rican or whatever, that they could see, hey, look at this one is this, and astronauts, ask whatever. That's what I would think would be really good, because this is kind of sad. You know, I mean, it's a true.
Well, but it's necessary.
Yeah, right. I
How
mean,
many
it's
teachers?
Huh?
How many teachers?
Well, yeah, here's what I always say when anybody ever proposes the next book for me. I say, if you start it, I'll help you out with it. I mean, you're still young, you can do it, okay? There's still time. And you've got all that history inside of you, so.
That needs to be a documentary.
I
not a
appreciate
book.
that. Yeah, that's
That
right.
needs to be on TV.
That's right. We're gonna take one more, or take two more questions, and then
Just
we're gonna.
what is
Yes.
the solution?
What is the solution? Oh my goodness! If I knew, I apologize. If I knew, I probably wouldn't be here with you. I'd be trying to solve some of these problems. My job is to catalog these stories and to share them with you. I think the solution comes in many different ways. One of the things I emphasize in my dissertation is the inter-ethnic community that is formed, right? So how it is that communities that had to look inward also found ways to look outward to build spaces with other Wisconsinites. The story of Our Lady of Guadalupe is a very interesting one, because while in the city of Milwaukee throughout the 1920s, Mexicans couldn't find an open spot for themselves, they did in the church. The Mexican Mission Chapel of Our Lady of Guadalupe was actually developed in concert with German American Catholics in the city of Milwaukee. And many of the festivals that were first created in the late 1920s were done in concert with white Catholics in the city. And so we need to look at places, small avenues, whether it's this mission church in the 1920s, or whether it's marches like this where we can bring different allied communities together. I think it's impossible to simply look inward, because first of all, we're a minority within a minority here in Wisconsin, and while our population will grow, some demographers believe to 1 million by 2050, that's years away, and I don't want to, I don't want to wait that long.
Right.
So I think we need to build coalitions with other groups.
Right.
Last question, last comment? Be a good
What
one.
happens when people are sent back to Mexico? Is that government and that feeling there welcome home, or is it more of how dare you, you traitor, now you have to come back to a spot you've never been?
Yeah.
And how does that play with the way things are in the world today?
So it is, I can assure you, it's almost never the latter. It's more towards the former, but it's never a rosy situation, because when people are deported, especially against their wishes, it's like splitting someone's soul in half. And so that individual or that family then has to find a way to make a home for themselves in a country that perhaps they left decades ago. And it's different for each country that people are sent back to. And it's very specific to the locale in which they're going to. So if a person is sent back to Mexico, it's not so much the Mexican federal government that they're interacting with, it's their local city, their local county, the family unit that they're returning to. The really difficult thing are for these dreamers, for many of them who have not been to Mexico in years, or perhaps have never been to Mexico, never been to Central America, never been to their home country. And so it's a form of having to restart their lives. And so I think one of the reasons that 86% of Wisconsinites believe that it's important for us to find a pathway to citizenship, for a way for these people to remain here in this country, is because we understand that their home is this one. That who they call their community, who they call members of their families, live right here beside them. And to send them back to a country they may have never known is perhaps the greatest injustice of all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.